Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sophia, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Marie Benedict's newest title, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for all of your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Marie Benedict for the launch of her newest book, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. Marie Benedict is a lawyer with more than 10 years experience as a litigator at two of the country's premier law firms and for Fortune 500 companies. She's a magna cum laude graduate of Boston College with a focus in history and art history, and a cum laude graduate of the Boston University School of Law. Marie, the author of The Other Einstein, Carnegie's Maid, The Only Woman in the Room, and Lady Clementine, views herself as an archaeologist of sorts, telling the untold stories of women. She lives in Pittsburgh with her family. Joining Marie in conversation is Lauren Willig. Lauren is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of more than 20 works of historical fiction, including Band of Sisters, The Summer Country, The English Wife, the RITA award-winning Pink Carnation series, and 3 novels co-written with Beatrice Williams and Karen White. Her books have been translated into over a dozen languages, awarded the RITA Booksellers Best and Golden Leaf Awards, and chosen for the American Library Association's annual list of the best genre fiction. An alumna of Yale University, she has a graduate degree in history from Harvard and a JD from Harvard Law School. She lives in New York City with her husband, 2 young children, and vast quantities of coffee. So, without further ado, please welcome Marie Benedict and Lauren Willig to the stage.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to me tonight, Lauren Willig. You're the best.
Oh, you're letting me celebrate your launch.
Well, I am just absolutely
the Strand for having us, and to everyone for being here tonight.
And I have to say, thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight. I mean, these are crazy pandemic times, and you guys have lots of choices of places to be from your home front. But we all know how important it is to support our local bookstores, especially iconic Strand bookstore, which I visited quite a few times when I lived in New York City. I loved it. And, you know, for the books really have that really power to connect us all. And so for you guys all to be here tonight to talk to Lauren and I about The Mystery of Mrs. Christie, a little hint of her upcoming book, The Band of Sisters, right? Which I loved. And I'm just so excited to be here. Thank you.
So let's get started talking about Mrs. Christie before the technology betrays us again, which it might be very quickly. So I've been dying to know, Agatha Christie she's such a household name. We all feel like we know her because we grew up with her books. I mean, the theme music of my childhood was that Poirot theme music that went on every Sunday at 9 with Mystery. I mean, I'm sure we could all hum it by heart. But of course, you know, the woman behind the book can be quite different. When you went into this, did you have a sense of who she was? And did that sense change at all as you were researching her?
What an interesting question. Yes and yes. I mean, at least I had this sense of who I thought she was, right? Like you, that theme song kind of sung in my head throughout my childhood. And then as I got older as well, I've always kind of returned to those David Suchet Poirot episodes. And I had this image of her in my mind as this matronly woman with, you know, the perfect gray hair, sort of quiet and elegant, but very understated. And the reality is that is who she was later in her life. But as I kind of went into that deep dive into the historical research, which you know so well, I learned that she was very, very different in the early years of her life. And once I kind of learned that disappearance, which we can talk about a little bit now or later, that was really a very pivotal event in her life. And it was really like the demarcation of who she was as a younger woman, and then who she became, that sort of public image that we think of, which wasn't that far off the mark, to be honest, that disappearance had actually changed her dramatically. I became even more intrigued with the idea of kind of exploring her in her life.
You raise such an interesting point. It's that notion that we have these images of public figures frozen in the most prominent part of their lives, but often they've really developed over time to become that way. They weren't like that at all once. And so,
That's exactly right.
so let's go right to the disappearance.
Oh, sure.
Which, to be honest, I hadn't heard about at all until a random TV movie about it about a year ago, when we were desperately looking for more British murdery things to watch. And my husband, by the way, tells me there's a Doctor Who episode about
I have heard that. I've heard that there's like a whole crack it open wide Doctor Who episode about the disappearance, which I really do need to see.
Apparently there are murder hornets, which is so appropriate for 2020, although maybe not so much for 2021.
And that would be why people have asked me questions about murder hornets. I had no idea what that was about. Now I really have to watch that episode. I get these random emails from readers about them. So now I understand.
So there are Whovians all over. It's not just my husband.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Anyway, so leaving aside the Whovians and the murder hornets, this isn't widely known now. We all just think of, Poirot and Miss Marple. How widely known was the disappearance in her day, and how pivotal an event do you think it was in her life?
Well, I think the disappearance, those 11 days, when she went, when the police found her car running on the edge of a cliff, to when she mysteriously resurfaced, really just as mysteriously as she had disappeared. Excuse me, those 11 days were hugely known during her lifetime. I mean, the coverage in the English papers, the American papers, really all across Europe as well, was almost like a paparazzi event. Like that's the only thing I can kind of equate it to today. Maybe it wasn't as popular during that time period as or as well known as, say, like the coverage of a royal wedding might have been, but it was pretty darn close. And there was something, certainly women and people had disappeared throughout England during that time period, but there was something about this very particular disappearance that really captivated people's interest. It was this idea that this young woman, she was the wife of a World War I hero. She was a mother. She had grown up in this really kind of idyllic seaside, upper class household, and kind of a way of life that was sort of disappearing in the years after World War I, that she had disappeared. And then layered kind of on top of that was the fact that she was this not famous, because she was not a famous person at this point. She was sort of a mystery novelist on the rise, but that she wrote mystery novels, right? And here she disappeared in circumstances that seemed torn from the pages of one of her own novels. So I think all of those things kind of conspired to pique not only people's interest, but journalists. And they were really camping out at their house, following the thousands and thousands of volunteers who were trying to find her. I mean, they were really like combing through fields, dredging the lake. I mean, they really felt like they could find her. And they kind of stirred up some of the controversy that was happening around it. I don't want to give too much away, but so I do think it was really widely known. And I think the fact of the fame of this disappearance impacted how she changed afterwards in many ways, in addition to sort of the reasons behind the disappearance in the first place.
So that woman we know on the book cover, that very put together woman who I can still picture smirking at me from my parents' editions, that she was the result of what happened in those mysterious 11 days.
Oh, absolutely. I think, before, when she was a young woman, really up until the disappearance, she was this very kind of gregarious, adventuresome person. She was the very first Western woman, they think, to have learned how to surf. She was, a nurse during World War I, when really a lot of upper class women weren't really filling that type of role. She had no aversion to blood and guts. She was, dealt with poisons as a pharmacist. I mean, she was really plunging into life in those early years. And that kind of sort of bold acceptance of adventure and opportunity is something that faded away as time went on. And I think in part it's because of what happened and how infamous her disappearance really became.
I also wonder how much of a push do you think it gave to her writing career? I mean, you don't want to think in those terms, but I've always wondered
Right.
what distinguishes her from the other golden age queens of mystery, because you've got Dorothy Sayers and
Singer.
Josephine Tay. I am so in love with Dorothy Sayers,
Oh,
but
I love her.
Gaudy Night, one of the most perfect books ever. But I've
And
always wondered why it is that Christie has captured the imagination in the way that Tay and Sayers and Allingham never did.
really haven't. I think
Yeah.
there's a couple reasons. I mean, I think just from a fame standpoint, certainly Dorothy Sayers was famous in her day, although her fame and sort of reputation hasn't extended on in the same way that Agatha's has. And I think there's really two components to that. I think, when she disappeared, she had just published. I think it was her sixth. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was her fifth novel. She had completed her sixth, and that was the Murder of Roger Ackroyd was absolutely her most well-received, successful novel to date. Like I said, though, she wasn't a household name. But by the time her next book came out, she was a household name. And not for reasons that she would have preferred, right? She was a household name because everyone knew about her disappearance. And that was, a very private matter that became extremely public. Now, query, and this is a query I hope you ask yourself as you read it, how much of that was part of her intention in disappearance, in her vanishing? I don't think it was, but really nobody knows because no one knows why she disappeared or exactly how and the circumstances around her disappearance. But in sort of my worldview, my fictional worldview, I think that she didn't anticipate the fame that came along with her disappearance. And I think she was not a stranger to using it for her own purposes after the fact, and certainly liked the book sales and the interest in her. But I think she really became very skittish of the public after that point. So I do think now as to why her legacy has lived on as opposed to somebody like Dorothy Sayers, who makes an appearance in the book. She's actually called in to help look for Agatha Christie as well, along with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which I think is just such a crazy fact. But I think there's just something about her books. She has created a perfect society in which things become very disordered, usually the murder and the circumstances around the murder. And yet, in a very kind of interesting way, she solves them and order is restored to the world. And I think there's something very kind of comforting yet exciting about that. And I think the fact that her books have those unsolvable puzzles at their core, not that you can't solve one of her mysteries, but they're very difficult to do so. She doesn't pull any tricks as she's crafting her story, but they're really hard to really parse out and kind of make sense of. And I think those two things, the sort of puzzly piece of it, and also the fact that order is restored to the world, really makes them very satisfying for people to read, especially now.
No, it's so funny that you said that, because when we do these events, you so often get asked, what are you reading now? And I felt so boring since last March when we went under lockdown, because all I've been reading is Golden Age crime fiction.
Oh, I love that.
But it's exactly what you were saying. It's because it's a safe world where at the end, order will always be restored. The knitting spinster detective is going to tell you who done it. The constable will come in, and the world will be put to rights, and everyone will have tea at the vicarage, and that rug will be somehow. But that's exactly what it is. It's very reassuring in a time of chaos. I mean, and there's that great Dorothy Sayers line. I can't remember which book it's from, but where she says, detective fiction is the purest fiction we have, because it's all about the restoration of order.
Yeah, no, I really think there's something. I think there's almost, of course, it's the 100th anniversary of Agatha's first book, but there's really been a resurgence of interest in her. I think in the past year for that reason. There's something very reassuring, very satisfying about her puzzles, and yet at the same time, a horrific event has happened at its core, and yet our spinster and our bachelor detectives are right out there. Our bachelor Belgian are right there at the core figuring it out for the best of us, and it kind of gives you hope that whatever disorder is in our world, of course in 2020 it's everything imaginable minus the murder. Well, I shouldn't say minus the murder hornets, because we did have murder hornets. Yeah. What was I thinking? What? really, we've had everything. The order can be restored. There is hope for all of us, right?
Well, I think, maybe that is part of the Christie appeal and what you were saying about the particular trickiness of her puzzles. That's something in an ordinary age would not be figured out, but when you're in the hands of Poirot or Miss Marple or Tommy and Tuppence that they will make it turn out right, that, justice is served.
Those little gray cells will be put to work. And I have to say, I'm so glad you mentioned Tommy and Tuppence because, I went on a huge binge of reading so many of her books as part of my research for this. And I love Tommy and Tuppence. And I feel like they're really underrated heroes and heroines of her novels. Like, of course, they don't appear as frequently as Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, but they're wonderful. I feel like they're due for a real resurgence.
I agree. And, it's one of my enduring frustrations that there is no good adaptation. I mean, the old ones were okay, but they're a little funky. And then there was that new one they tried to do that was just putridly horrible.
It was horrible. This is just a little bit of an aside, but that's based on the World War II thriller that Agatha wrote, N or M, the one that was just the recent adaptation. Mm-hmm. And Kate Quinn and I actually did, we found a sort of an overlap between that book and the research she was doing on Bletchley Park from World War II. And so we actually wrote a short story, an Audible original for that. But what was interesting about it is that after reading that and then watching that adaptation, it was like two completely different books. I mean, what was on that screen was not at all what Agatha Christie would have written, that's for sure. So I feel like you're right. Like, we need those characters to come alive in a really fresh way.
And of course, it's funny, just sort of thinking on the fly here, you're talking about her sort of wilder, more impulsive youth. Tommy and Tuppence feel so 1920s to me, whereas Poirot and Miss Marple, they are very much that post-war period, even though I know a lot of Poirot was written pre-war, but you really feel that sort of post-war Britain rationing, decaying atmosphere, whereas Tommy and Tuppence, you can hear the Jazzy Jeeves and Worcester music in the background.
Oh, totally. And I love that. And what's funny about, and there's a couple of her earlier books, not to get too much on a tangent, but The Man in the Brown Suit in particular, if anyone is familiar with that one, it's an oldie. It's one of her first books, one of Agatha's first books. And it's really less of a mystery book and more of like a thriller. A character she never repeats. It's a very young woman. And what's interesting about that is that it shows a side of Agatha, I feel like, when she was very much like the character that's at the heart of that book. She's young, she's adventuresome, she trots off to South Africa to follow a stolen diamond in much the way that Agatha herself trotted off to South Africa, with her husband as part of this year-round tour, leaving behind her 1-year-old in the care of her mother for a year. So, you get to see through those pages what she was like in those early days, and you can imagine the woman that she was leading up to that disappearance, when sort of the societal forces were kind of building up and weighing her down and really changing her in a way. She started to feel this pressure of, that sense that ambition was a dirty word, that she shouldn't be focused on writing. She should really be focused exclusively on her family and her husband, which she was as well. But writing and having a career wasn't something that women did during that time. If you had to work, it was because you needed them for financial reasons only, not because it was something you loved unto itself. And you can sort of see the early person that she was, and then how those conflicts really come into play through those pages. But I agree with you, Tommy and Tuppence, because she wrote that before this, they're her. They're who she was at that time.
So was it hard sifting through the books and filtering out the bits that were her versus the bits that were pure fiction? How do you disentangle this as an author, as a researcher?
Well, I think it's probably something that you do all the time too. As you're sifting through, in many ways I looked at her novels as research. And it was the best kind of research, right? Sit down and read a slew of Agatha Christie novels. What could be better? But, as writers, we include, intentionally or subconsciously, we include little bits and pieces of ourselves in those pages, whether it's the topic we select or the characters we're interested in depicting. And, reading the books that led up to the murder of Roger Aykroyd, which I feel like plays such a hand in her disappearance, that quintessential unreliable narrator, and depicting things one way and having the truth maybe be something else, I think really played a big hand in her disappearance. But the books that lead up to that, you can kind of see the arc of the things that are troubling her, the issues that she's grappling with. And just like you said about the difference between the early Tommy and Tuppence and the World War II Tommy and Tuppence, they are two totally different characters. And there are parts in the later Tommy and Tuppence in which you can almost see Tommy and Tuppence, the married couple, for those of you who don't know, were spies at one point. You can almost see the two sides of Agatha's. It's like her internal battle. One wants to go for it and do the spy work, and the other's like, we're too old for that, So you get to see, as I was sifting through and thinking about what reflected Agatha, what reflected what was on her mind, the kind of person she was kind of evolving into. It was almost like I was matching that up alongside the timeline of her life, the real life events of her life, and seeing what bits and pieces of her I could kind of sift out of the books. It was so much fun. It was so satisfying, and also such a delight to actually see her in those pages.
That is so fascinating. It's like her books are a game of Clue, and you're going from room to room, picking up the different clues in the different parts of her life.
I love that analogy. Yes, that is exactly what it's like. Did she use the rope over here? I'm not sure, but it's possible. But they really do, interestingly, especially in the early years, they really do align quite well in terms of the sort of life stage that she's in, the kinds of things that are spinning around her mind, and what I'm seeing in the book. Even just the tones of the book really mirror the bits and pieces of her life as well.
Right, because it's so interesting, because these books have been televised and adapted so much, and she has so many, and we've seen them so out of order so many times. It's really created, I think, in general, a sense of distance between the book and the author, that it's very seldom you get such a personal sense of Agatha Christie.
Well, that was kind of what was fun about writing the book, because I do feel like that. I feel like she herself is so very much a part of these pages. I mean, she is depicting a historical moment in time, whether you realize it or not, and the forces that are at play, and the forces that are at play on a woman as well, and the forces that were at play in her own personal life. But you're right, we so often are told these stories kind of like mix and match. It could be Poirot Poirot's in her very first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and he's all the way through until she kills him off. And the world that Poirot inhabits is very different, and the woman who's writing Poirot is very different throughout that kind of arc of time. And so it was really interesting to kind of pick and choose. Interestingly, she wrote a whole series of books by I think I'm gone. Can you still hear me? Oh, I'm back.
I can still hear you. Okay, I got your icon back now.
Oh, yay! She wrote a series of books under a pseudonym called Mary Westmacot, and they're actually kind of like romance novels a little bit. They're different. Oh. And you actually see a lot more of her in those pages than you do even in the mystery novel. So they're not as satisfying in the world is disordered and fixed kind of way, but they're really interesting kind of glimpses into her life as well.
Oh, so I have to ask, what happened to those Westmacot books? Did they stay in print, or did they sort of disappear into the mists of time?
They're not as popular. You can still get them. You can still order them. You can still listen to a few of them. But they have, I don't want to say a staidness to them, but they don't have that kind of propulsion that you feel in mysteries. You're moving forward because you're trying to solve a mystery, whether it's a murder or something else. In those books, there's a lot of rumination, and which is very appropriate for the time kind of novels that they are, but it doesn't have the same allure, I think, as a Christie mystery. And I understand you guys can't see me anymore, but can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can everyone else?
I've turned into a space invader.
Anyway, so Marie, now that you're back, one of these things I was thinking about while you were talking before the murder hornets took you was, your other books have been about women who have done great things, but have not been very well known. They've been sort of, the footnotes to history, like Clementine Churchill or Carnegie's Maid, or of course the Other Einstein.
Right.
Agatha Christie, Mr. Christie is kind of a cipher. Who cares about him? What made you decide to work against type and pick someone so well known in her own right?
I mean, that's a great question. And it's something I really struggled with, to be honest, because I feel, I feel like I'm kind of on this weird mission where I'm like trying to unearth all these women and kind of bring out their legacies and their contributions out into the light of modern day, where we can really appreciate and understand what they've done and how beholden we really are to them. So when I first, Agatha Christie's been on my list forever because I've been an Agatha Christie fan my whole life. And I was always so curious about her and her life because I really didn't know anything about her and how she kind of rose up to become this unbelievable, force. I don't even know. There's not a word big enough to describe Agatha Christie, I don't think. So
that Shakespearean line about, he bestrides the world like a colossus. Except in this one, she bestrides the book world like a colossus.
She does. I mean, her fingerprints are on so many things, and she lives on and resonates, and her name sort of conjures up its own sort of world, really.
Well, it's so funny. My parents, they were living in Japan in the 70s, and my mother said the only English language books they could get were Agatha Christie. You could find the complete English language Agatha Christie in Japan.
Fascinating.
You couldn't get anything else, which I think just sort of says how incredibly broad her influence was.
Exactly. At a time when you couldn't find anything else, you could find Agatha Christie, by God. So I think, when I look, my goal is always to try and find these women who are underappreciated, who are unknown. And, I've really tried to do that with a variety of women from different backgrounds and different time periods. But the other thing I'm kind of looking at or trying to find when I select a historical woman is a woman who's really struggling with an issue that feels very modern and timely to me, excuse me. And that can vary from woman to woman. And again, it's when a little bit of those autobiographical stuff, if it's something I'm struggling with, I might be interested in a woman that's struggling with it. And so when I, of course, couldn't stop myself from digging into Agatha's research before I decided to write about her. And to my mind, the struggle that she went through that led up to her disappearance was a struggle that really resonates still today. It's that struggle between family and work. It's the struggle, I think, that a lot of women feel about being ambitious, about feeling guilty about their ambition. And I think it was those sorts of issues, which are, really strong societal forces that I feel like still exist today and really played a role on Agatha, in Agatha's life as she got a little bit older and right leading up to her disappearance. I felt like that was something I wanted to pick at and unravel, because I'm experiencing it in my own life. I have two boys, 15 and 12. And, like you and I were talking earlier, if I'm not working, I feel like I need to be with them. And either way, I feel guilty, whether I'm with them, I feel guilty that I'm not writing. When I'm writing, I feel like guilty that I'm not with them. So I wanted to look at that and because I had this sense that understanding the way that role played out in her life might not just solve a mystery of what actually happened to her, but might help me and maybe others better understand how she rose up to claim her legacy, what sacrifices she had to make to do it, and what she had to embrace. Because in many ways, this story is unusual, not just because she's famous, but because the way I look at it, it's a story about a historical woman rising up and claiming her own story, writing her own narrative, rather than me going back into the past, finding them and giving them a second life and claiming that narrative for them. I feel like she did that during her lifetime. I think she wrote herself back in. And I think, but she knew society would never allow her to own that or say it publicly. And I think that's one of the reasons that she receded. She was able to kind of solve that quandary in her life and claim what was really rightfully hers. But she wasn't strutting around telling people about it. She had to be a very different person in the aftermath of that. So to me, it was less about her legacy and more about this kind of very, very, I feel like, modern issue that she dealt with.
And I mean, really, you could have no idea when you were working at how much more acute this issue was going to become during the pandemic.
Oh my God. Right? I mean, I think the pandemic threw into bold relief the disparity in the work-life balance that most women have, the responsibilities that most women shoulder, and in comparison to the male population, and how very, very real and present and strong that struggle really is. So many women have had to drop out of the workforce because of that struggle, throughout the pandemic. So, it really, I wrote it before the pandemic happened. I edited it, part of it during it, but for the most part, it was finished. But I feel like that this whole situation, this horrible 2020 that we've all experienced, has really made even clearer how important that issue is.
And I see it's 7:45, which means it's time for us to switch over to audience questions.
Yay! But
I have questions for Marie. Let's see, there's the Ask a Question bucket. Okay, and here's one I was going to ask, which is, what are you planning to work on next?
Well, I have to say the pandemic was it was very challenging, as it was for all of us, but it was also a very prolific period for me. I actually wrote 5 books in 18 months, and 2 of them were novellas and not full stories. So I actually have 2 books coming out in the next year. I have a book coming out in June, a co-written one, which you're the master of, Lauren, and I have another book coming out next January. So next June, I have a book coming out. It's called The Personal Librarian. It was really my first co-written foray, so something new for me, with a wonderful writer, Victoria Christopher Murray. And it's the story of, you all are familiar with J.P. Morgan. Some of those who you have visited New York recently or in the past 100 years, or live in New York, or might be familiar with the Morgan Library, which is a wonderful jewel box of an institution, which J.P. Morgan built in the early 1900s to house his rare and ancient manuscript collection. He hired a woman to run it. Her name was Belle DaCosta Green. During the 4 decades she ran it, she became the most powerful person in the art world because she had unlimited funds. But the only way she was able to fulfill that role was to hide her true identity. She was actually African American, and she was fair enough that she could pass as white. So in a time period when she wouldn't have even been allowed in the Morgan Library, she rose up to become its directress. That's what she called herself. And so it's a book that explores her really unusual situation, but also, this really important time period in American history. When in the years after the Civil War, when we had the promise of equality, white supremacy really rose up to suppress that. And so Belle inhabited a world of Jim Crow laws and segregation. So it kind of really takes a look at both of those things. So that comes out in June. And I have my next book is about Rosalind Franklin. So if you know her, but she was a famous scientist in British in the 1940s and 50s. And she actually was the discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA. And one of her colleagues took her data and this very special X-ray photograph she created and used it against her without her knowledge or permission to write a paper for which the 3 of them won the Nobel Prize. And she did not.
Wow. So talk about 2 very different time periods, 2 different women.
Yeah. I love it. I love that I can I always wanted to maybe be a professor, but then I have to narrow my focus to one particular thing. This way I can explore any time period, any subject matter. I love it.
Yeah, that was exactly my experience too, where I loved academia, but I hated that your focus had to be so narrow. And the joy of being a historical novelist is you get to be a historical dilettante. And
exactly.
From place to place.
I love it. You're a girl after my own heart. That's the best part of it. I agree.
Yeah, getting to say, to research whatever takes your fancy and call it work. Although
exactly.
That's one of the more annoying bits of the pandemic is not being able to get to archives we want to get to.
That and not visiting places. That was really hard because I love to visit the places. And for the most part, I have visited all the places I've written about. And and even though historical places are not always exactly the same as the world that you're depicting.
Like, how dare they improve things?
Right? How dare they change the landscape? But it's super helpful and fun at the same time, which I love.
Yes, and anyone who hasn't seen it yet should look on Marie's Instagram and see all of the Agatha Christie pictures she's been posting. Okay, there are a ton of questions. I realize I have not been getting through them. So let's see.
That's no fun.
Let's see. Would you consider writing a historical novel about Jane Austen or the Brontes in the future? Who are your favorite authors from the past?
Ooh, well, certainly Jane Austen's on the list. I love Jane Austen. I do. I feel like her life has been explored and kind of like,
But she's also, I feel like she's been so misunderstood that it's like exactly what you're saying about Agatha Christie.
Yeah,
we have
that's
this
true.
image of prim Jane, with her nieces and nephews. And this was a whitewash job done by her niece after the fact. When you read her letters, she talks about getting so drunk she pukes. I mean, she was a real Georgian.
I love that. I did not know that. That's awesome.
Squiffy at a party, because I mean, when we see all of these sort of TV adaptations of her works, they're all very sort of late Regency. Everything is very prim and proper. It's this drawing room world. But she came of age in earlier, bawdier era, because the Georgians were really, they drank, they were coarse, they were not prim. And
I love that.
Yeah, and something that people don't generally know is Pride and Prejudice was actually written well pre-Regency. It's a Georgian book. But whenever, I know these are such ridiculous historian distinctions.
No, but that's really interesting. Is it so the adaptations are just done within that time period? Exactly. Is that why we think of it?
Adaptations tend to put them sort of into Jane Regency land, because that's what we expect. But actually, Pride and Prejudice, originally called First Impressions, was ran earlier.
That's so interesting. See, that's the kind of thing that, like, I hear that, and now I could go down an entirely different rabbit hole and explore somebody. So maybe Jane's story does need to be told. I mean, when you think about it,
what was going on in her life, she almost got married. She broke off the engagement. I mean, she wasn't this meek, quiet little spinster. There was stuff going on there.
See, that's interesting. And the Bronte sisters, I do know a little. They're each so different. I don't know a huge amount, but I know that some of them were, not as you would expect at all. Yes. And I feel like there's one sister in particular who she's on my list, actually. I wanted to explore her a little bit, but I won't.
You've got her on the list. Yeah, I mean, I love the memes that have been going around recently about what is it? Jane Eyre falls in love with crazy man. Wuthering Heights falls in love with crazy man, and tenant of Wildfield Hall falls in love with Hart Farmer, lives out happily ever after. I mean, it's just which Bronte sister would you rather be?
Right. And what mashup would you like in your world? But I feel like, you're right. It's when you look at history and when you look at these literary figures, it's all about the lens through which they've been depicted. It isn't really who they are. I mean, it's really not that different from the book, The Only Woman in the Room, that I wrote about Hedy Lamarr. I mean, people have this image. I mean, she was not so famous today, but she was very famous in her day. They have the very specific image of who she was, this sort of, exotic, very sensual woman. And I'm not saying she wasn't either one of those things, but she was so much more than that. And when we look at historical women and modern women, right, we really have to think about the lens through which we are viewing them and viewing ourselves. And that's one of my objectives, is to really make people think about that.
And it's those archaeological layers then, especially better known women like Jane Austen or Agatha Christie, where you have to peel off those layers.
Right.
Because sometimes they've invented their own legacy, or in other cases, family members, like with Jane Austen, have gone through and burned letters and sanitized to try to create an image that will be more in keeping with a later age.
Oh, I like that. I did not know that. I think that's fascinating because again, and it's like, what image of what sort of woman are you trying to create, right? And you're right. Which time period would find this particular character more or less attractive, offensive? I think these are things that people need to ask themselves. I think about the world that we inhabit as well. I mean, it's sometimes easier, I feel like, to see that more clearly from the distance of the past, or from the distance of the future, right? Looking at the past. But those are the same kind of lenses we need to look at through our own world as well.
There was a very interesting article that was making the rounds, I think it was from the Mary Sue, about corsets in the Bridgerton series, and how historical film versions always get corsets wrong. That there's this idea of corsets as being this kind of, binding on women, that they're, the wasp waist and all that, which was only really true for a very specific moment.
Very short period in time.
Exactly. Whereas for most time, they were no more restrictive than the modern bra. But this article made a very interesting point about how it actually reflects something about our society and the cult of thinness and fitness we impose upon women. And
that's interesting.
Involving historical women for corset fixations is our way of trying to make ourselves feel better for our own body image issues, which I found absolutely fascinating.
That's really interesting. Oh, I'm going to need you to forward me that.
Oh, I
article.
will definitely forward it to you.
I think that's
those things you read and you're like, oh my God, this is so right. How did I never see this before?
Right. And it really makes you think a lot about your own world and the own life that you inhabit.
And your own historical preconceptions, because it's so hard as a historical author to filter out what you thought you knew about a time period or a person. And you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of some of these things you have misimagined? Why did you believe this about a time period? What does that tell us about us and our expectations?
Oh, I love that. Oh, you're so good. I love it.
But anyway, I'm so bad as a moderator because these questions are just
you're so good. You're so good.
Okay, let's see. Where were we? Let's see. Okay, how can you tell us about your research process? How do you find sources? How do you organize your research?
Ooh,
it seems like the subjects you tackle have so much detail to weave in, which is so true.
That is true. Well, it's so different from woman to woman, I mean, that's the biggest challenge, actually, probably because I do skip around from time period to time period and subject matter as well. I've written about a writer, I've written about, two different kinds of scientists. I have a scientist coming down the pike, a librarian. It's a politician, so for each one of those characters, it's going to be completely different. But probably like you, Lauren, the original source material is what I want, if I can get it, if I can get my hands on it, right? You can't always. For a lot of historical women, their records, their journals, their documents, their stories, they weren't considered worthy of keeping. And so, when you take a man who's from the same time period, kind of similarly situated, you can find a wealth of information. But for a woman, there's hardly anything. So sometimes, at least I find myself kind of sifting through the man's material to try and find out something about the woman. And then, of course, you have to ask yourself that question, whose perspective of her am I getting? Now, I think a really good example is probably Maid Einstein from my first book, The Other Einstein, which if you haven't read it, it's about Albert Einstein's first wife, who he met at university, who was a physicist also. And in that case, I mean, of course, how many books can there be about Albert Einstein? There's like an entire bookstore in this one city I went to about Albert Einstein. I mean, there's a plethora of biographies, assessments, scientific and otherwise. But about poor Maid Einstein, there's hardly anything, except there are two groups of letters between she and Albert, which they've dubbed the love letters, which were discovered in a shoebox in the 1980s. And this other group of letters between her and her BFF from university, which were left to this woman's great-grandson and which recently surfaced. And I was able to get access to both sets of those letters. And those letters informed almost everything I could think of about that character. So whether it was the kinds of thoughts she had, the way she spoke, the way she looked at herself, how that changed over time, the kinds of things she and Albert discussed. It wasn't about, what they're going to have for dinner. It was about the latest physics theories. So, you get a very interesting perspective, and that's the golden standard, or whatever the right phrase is. It was tricky with Agatha because a lot of her stuff is not available. Her family keeps it locked down tight. A lot of her things. What I loved the most personally was her autobiography. If any of you are Agatha Christie fans and you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It was written late in her life, when she was, I think, in her late 70s into her 80s. And part of it is narrated. So you get to hear her voice narrating her own story, which is to die for. You have to hear her voice. It's fabulous. But it's very much the ramblings of an older woman looking back on her life. But you really get a sense of who she was, what she valued, the kind of life that she had, and how things changed. But what's most fascinating to me about that whole autobiography, which I used a lot, was the fact that she never mentioned her disappearance. Not one time. She never spoke about her disappearance. And to me, it was almost like that gap, that crack, that absence. It was like an invitation to go in
Those omissions, they are. It's like when I was in grad school, they always used to talk about the gaps in the historiography. And you find that gap and you get so excited because you're like, what's lurking in there?
Something good. Because if it weren't hidden, if somebody wasn't working hard to keep it hidden, that's what's interesting, that stuff. And so, in the case of Agatha's, you love to get an autobiography. It's like a journal. Although, of course, again, like with journals and letters, there's a lens that they're sharing their story as well. But I very much, that was in one case when I was happy that there was an absence, because I felt like it was an invitation. It was a crack in the historical record, such as it was, in which I could kind of crawl and see what I could find. But I needed to do all the work leading up to it and afterwards to see what that gap meant to her, and how that shadow of history, that hidden part, really played out before and after.
Okay, let's see. Do we have time for another question?
Maybe one more?
Okay, let's see. What have we got here? Okay, here's a good one. What's your favorite Agatha Christie novel? Are you more a fan of Hercule Poirot or of Miss Marple?
I love them both for different reasons, and when I'm in different moods. I don't know. When I want something a little softer, I go for a Miss Marple. And probably in the Miss Marple world, I like A Murder Is Announced. I don't know if you know that one, but that's it's Chipping Cleghorn, the little town, and which I love the name. And they get an invitation to a murder, and they think it's a murder mystery, like a house party, but it's not. It's a real murder. So that is a really just perfect one in my mind. I love me a Hercule Poirot. I do. And I have to say, my two favorites are the two most famous ones, Death on the Nile and Murder on the Orient Express. I love those, even though there's something about The Mysterious Affair at Styles that is really, I don't know, his first appearance is really exciting to me. And he's kind of unformed. He's like clay at that point. There's little bits and pieces of him, but he's not fully formed yet. Of course, Unreliable Narrator, and just from how important this book was to me, is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. For those people who haven't read it, it's the story of a murder that takes place in a town, and it's narrated by the town doctor. And that narration is uber important. But if I can tell you, there's I have two little favorites that are lesser known. One I kind of talked a little bit about earlier. It's called The Man in the Brown Suit. And that's one of these early Agatha Christie's. It's not quite a typical mystery. It's about a heist, a diamond heist in this underworld. And what I love it for, it's very different from her other books. It's the young Agatha Christie, the very adventuresome, gregarious. You get to see what she was like before all this happened. And to see her on the other side, I love N or M, which is a Tommy and Tuppence book. And it's actually a spy thriller set in World War II. And it's this older, middle-aged Tommy and Tuppence who want to play a role in the war. And they've been marginalized due to their age. And in many ways, this is a very autobiographical book, N or M. And it's wonderful for that reason, too. So kind of some odd favorites, but they're ones that were really, they were like little lightning bolts for me. And as I was kind of doing my timeline of her life and the books I was reading, I could see Agatha, really clearly in the pages of those books. So I loved those.
I have just such an image now of sort of her shadow looming over the book at you.
Oh my gosh, she was there every step of the way. And so were all of her books. You should see my very dirty workroom right now. They're still there.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, both of you. I apologize for all our technical mishaps tonight, but I really appreciate it. We pulled together. Everyone was great. Thank you. I want to thank both Lauren and Marie for being here with us tonight, talking about this very, very interesting, the mystery of Mrs. Christie, because I've never read a mystery book, and now I want to read all of them.
You have so many to read now.
Oh my gosh.
Excellent recommendations. Thank you.
Oh, I hope they work for you.
I can't wait. Thank you to our audience for joining us tonight, our first event of the new year. We appreciate all of you. If you haven't already and feel very inclined to read something very mysterious for a new year, The purchase button for The Mystery of Mrs. Christie is at the bottom of our screen, so please feel free to click on it. Is there anything you both would like to say to our audience before we depart for the night?
I would like to say a couple things. I'd like to say thank you to the Strand for hosting us tonight. It was a delight. I feel like a novel could be written about the Strand, Book Row. I feel like there's something there. I'm just throwing it out there. But I've just loved being here. I love the Strand when I lived in New York. And I appreciate everyone coming out tonight to talk and listen to us talk. And I want to thank Lauren because she is fabulous. So much fun to talk to, so knowledgeable. And you all have to read her next novel because it is. I had the pleasure. I was supposed to bring it up with me. I'm sorry. I was going to hold it up. It is so good. It's the story of these incredible women from Smith College who burst into the world. And can I say what they do? Is that okay?
Absolutely. There's no mystery to it.
Okay. Oh, I didn't want to mess anything up. But they go on and basically go to serve in World War I. This is before America actually technically gets involved, right? And they are out there on the fields helping people, serving in whatever way they can. And their bravery and courage is unbelievable. And it's based on true stories. So it's really a treat. And you all have to, it's March. Tell me the date. I'm sorry.
March 2nd. So
March 2nd.
For Women's History Month. And we're going to have a big Women's History Month launch party.
It's gonna be so fun.
Yes. And you can hear Marie and I bantering some more on March 1st. It's going to be done via William Morrow. So I think we'll both be posting about it at some point. You can hear us geeking out more about history and forgotten women, because this is another story where these women were so well known in their time. There were reams of articles written about them. They were just a sensation. And now if you ask anyone about the Smith College Relief Unit and World War I, they'll be like, what, who? So come join us on March 1st to hear all about those forgotten women and more about Marie's upcoming books, which are so exciting and fabulous.
It's ditto, I have to say. This has been so much fun. And everybody support your local bookstores. They've been so important to us all, always, but especially now. They connect us and they're really the hub of our communities and really important. So
and let's make sure they're still here when this is all over and we're able to leave the house again, because we need that old book smell, and you can't find it anywhere better than someplace like the Strand.
Oh my God, I know. I love it. I miss it.
Me too, so much. So we'll have to all promise that we will be together at an event at the Strand for real.
Oh, I would love that. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Yes. A great New Year's resolution.
Yes. Oh gosh, I would love it. Absolutely.
And in the meantime, we can hunker down with our copies of The Mystery of Mrs. Christie and then binge read all of the Agatha Christie oeuvre.
Oh yeah, you've got to. Thank you all so much. Thank you both so much. Virtual hug.
Virtual hug.
Thank you,
safe, everyone.
Wonderful authors. Thank you, our wonderful audience. Thanks for joining us, and have a good rest of your nights.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.